midnight caller. I wish I could tell you this story ended well, that I found a rational explanation for everything that happened, wrapped it up in a neat little bow, and moved on with my life. But I can't. What I can tell you is this. If your phone rings at exactly midnight, don't answer it, no matter what. Especially if the voice on the other end sounds like your own. Let me start from the beginning. 3 months ago, I moved to Millbrook, Vermont, following what my therapist diplomatically called a life reset. That's a nice way of saying I was running away from a failed marriage, a stalled career, and the suffocating pressure of a life that no longer felt like my own. I'm a graphic designer, freelance now, thanks to the divorce eating up my client list along with everything else. The silver lining was that I could work from anywhere, and real estate in Millbrook was surprisingly affordable. Too affordable, as it turns out. There's always a reason when something seems too good to be true. The house I bought was a Victorian-era beauty. All gabled windows and aged wooden siding painted a faded blue-gray. 3 stories of vintage charm, complete with a turret study that the real estate agent called a unique architectural feature. The previous owners had apparently moved out in a hurry, leaving behind some old furniture and a musty smell that no amount of cleaning seemed to touch. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I fell into a routine quickly. Freelance work meant irregular hours, and I often found myself awake long past midnight, bathed in the blue glow of my computer screen as I tweaked logos and layouts for clients who couldn't quite articulate what they wanted. The house's creaks and groans became familiar background noise, a constant reminder that I wasn't completely alone in my self-imposed exile. The first call came on a Tuesday night, October 12th to be exact. I remember the date because I'd just finished a project for a local Halloween festival, and the invoice was still open on my screen. The clock on my computer clicked over to 12 a.m. just as the landline rang. Yes, I had a landline. The cell reception in Millbrook was spotty at best, especially in my new home. The previous owners had left behind an old cream-colored phone, its spiral cord stretched and kinked from years of use. I'd kept it connected mostly for emergencies, and because it felt wrong somehow to disconnect one of the house's original features. The ring startled me. It wasn't the harsh electronic trill of modern phones, but a real bell sound, deep and resonant. I almost didn't answer it. Who calls at midnight, right? But I was awake anyway, and something about that ring seemed to demand a response. Hello? At first there was only static, a soft hiss like distant rain. Then, beneath it, a voice. I couldn't tell if it was male or female. It existed in that ambiguous space between pitches, like a choir of whispers all speaking at once. Where did you bury the bird, Alex? My blood turned to ice. The bird. They were talking about Lucky, my parakeet from when I was 8 years old. I'd found him dead one morning and, devastated, had insisted on a proper burial. Behind the maple tree in our backyard, wrapped in my favorite blue handkerchief. I'd never told anyone about the handkerchief. It was my secret shame, sacrificing it for my pet's burial. Not even my parents knew. They'd assumed I'd lost it. Who is this? My voice didn't shake, but my hands did. Blue cotton, hand-stitched edges, your grandmother's initials in the corner. You cried for weeks, not because of Lucky, but because you couldn't tell anyone about the handkerchief. The static grew louder, building like an approaching storm. How do you... Time's up, Alex. 2 minutes, 13 seconds. Same time tomorrow. The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, holding the phone, listening to the dial tone blend with the sound of my own heartbeat. My eyes drifted to the computer screen. 12:02 a.m. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the caller had been exactly right about the duration. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone from my hometown, someone who'd known me as a kid. But the detail about the handkerchief? That was impossible. I'd never told anyone. Never. I unplugged the phone before going to bed that night. Told myself I was being silly, that it was just a prank call, probably some local kids who'd looked me up online. But as I lay in bed, staring at the shadows cast by streetlights on my ceiling, a nagging thought kept circling in my mind. The phone had rung at exactly midnight, even unplugged. I know this because I checked the cord 3 times before going upstairs, and still I heard it ring, the sound muffled by my closed bedroom door, but unmistakable. One long, deep toll, like a church bell marking the witching hour. I pulled my pillow over my head and pretended I couldn't hear it ring 11 more times before falling silent. That was just the beginning. I didn't know it then, but those 2 minutes and 13 seconds would be the first thread unraveling in a tapestry of normalcy I'd spent years weaving. Each night that followed would bring another call, another riddle, another piece of my past served back to me in that strange, multi-toned voice. And each night, the voice would get a little clearer, a little more familiar, until I finally recognized it as my own. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how it all happened, step by step, night by night. Because maybe then you'll believe me when I tell you about the final call, the one that changed everything. The one that made me realize why the previous owners had left in such a hurry, and why the real estate agent's smile had seemed so strained when she handed me the keys. The one that made me understand what really happened in this house 20 years ago, and why it's happening again now. Let me tell you about the second night, because that's when things started getting truly strange. That's when I realized these calls weren't just about my past, they were about something much bigger. Something that had been waiting in this house, in this town, for a very long time. Waiting for someone like me. I spent most of the next day trying to convince myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. The unplugged phone ringing? Classic stress-induced hallucination, right? I even called my therapist, Dr. Martinez, though I didn't mention the specifics of the call. Just told her I was having trouble sleeping in the new house. She suggested meditation apps and melatonin, and I pretended that would help. But as evening approached, I felt a growing unease, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. I tried to work, but my concentration kept slipping. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift to that cream-colored phone on my desk. I'd left it unplugged. What was the point in connecting it if it could ring anyway? At 11:55 p.m., I started recording on my phone. If something was going to happen, I wanted proof. The video shows exactly what I saw that night. Me, sitting at my desk, alternating between staring at the unplugged landline and checking the time on my computer. The quality isn't great, just my desk lamp for lighting, but you can clearly see that the phone is disconnected. At exactly midnight, it rang. In the video, you can see me jump. The sound is clear in the recording, that same deep, resonant bell tone. I remember my hands shaking as I reached for the receiver, even though the rational part of my brain was screaming at me to ignore it. Hello? My voice sounds strange in the recording, tight with fear. The static was there again, but fainter this time. The voice came through clearer. Tell me about the treehouse, Alex, the one where you left the letter. My mouth went dry. The treehouse. I hadn't thought about that in 20 years. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied. Blue notebook paper, 3 pages. You never gave it to her. September 15th, 1998. Dear Jessica. Stop. The word came out as a whisper. You kept it folded in your math textbook for a week. Then you hid it in the loose board in the treehouse floor. It's still there, isn't it? Unless... I felt sick. The letter to Jessica Martinez, my first real crush, had been my deepest secret in 8th grade. I'd poured my heart out in those 3 pages, then lost my nerve. Hid it in the old treehouse behind my parents' house, promising myself I'd give it to her the next day. But I never did. And when we moved away that summer, the letter stayed behind, hidden under that loose board. How could you possibly know about that? Have you wondered why the house feels so familiar, Alex? Why the stairs creak exactly like the ones in your childhood home? Why the view from your study window matches the one from your old treehouse? My blood ran cold. Because they were right. I had noticed these things, had written them off as coincidence or my mind playing tricks on me. But hearing them spoken aloud, in that strange voice that seemed to echo with multiple tones, who are you? Time's running out. 2 minutes, 13 seconds. But before I go, check the loose floorboard under your desk, the one that creaks when you roll your chair back. The line went dead. In the video, you can see me sit there for a long moment, just staring at the phone. Then, slowly, I roll my chair back. There's a distinct creak, one I'd noticed my first day here but hadn't thought much about. My hands trembled as I knelt down and pressed on the edge of the board. It lifted easily, as if it had been removed many times before. And there, in the dusty space beneath, was a piece of paper. Blue notebook paper, folded into quarters, yellowed with age. The video ends there, but I can tell you what that paper was. I didn't need to unfold it to know. I remembered every word I'd written on those 3 pages. Somehow, impossibly, it was my letter to Jessica, the one I'd hidden in a treehouse hundreds of miles away 20 years ago. But that's not the strangest part. When I finally got the courage to unfold it, I found something that made my entire world shift sideways. The letter wasn't in my handwriting. It was in my father's. And it wasn't to Jessica Martinez. It was to my mother, dated September 15th, 1978, exactly 20 years before I wrote my own letter. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat at my desk until sunrise, reading and rereading that letter, trying to make sense of it. The words were different from my letter to Jessica, but the feelings were the same. Young love, fear of rejection, the weight of an unspoken truth. And beneath it all, a growing certainty that something impossible was happening in this house. Something that connected past and present in ways I couldn't understand. I didn't know it then, but that letter was just the beginning. Each night would bring another call, another piece of the puzzle, and with each revelation, the line between my past and someone else's would blur a little more. But it was the 3rd night that truly showed me how deep this rabbit hole went. Because that's when the voice started telling me things about my future. Things that hadn't happened yet. Things that shouldn't have been possible to know. I spent the next day digging through every piece of information I could find about my father's past. Mom had never mentioned him living in Millbrook, but then again, she rarely talked about their early years together. The divorce when I was 12 had left too many raw edges, too many unspoken hurts. I called her that afternoon, trying to sound casual as I asked about Dad's life before they met. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "It's funny you should ask," she said. "I was just going through some old photos yesterday. Found one of the house where we first met. Old Victorian place in Vermont. Can't remember the town name now." My throat tightened. "Millbrook? That's it. How did you—" She paused. "Alex, is everything okay? You sound strange." I made up some excuse about researching family history for a personal project. Ended the call quickly before she could ask more questions. But her revelation had confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. This house, my house, was somehow connected to my family's past in ways I couldn't explain. That night, I was ready. I set up 3 different cameras, my phone, my laptop, and an old digital camera I used for work, all trained on the phone, all with fresh batteries or plugged into power strips. I also had a digital voice recorder running. 11:59 p.m. The familiar dread settled in my stomach as I watched the seconds tick by on my computer screen. Midnight. The phone rang. This time I didn't hesitate. "What do you want from me?" The static was almost gone now. The voice came through crystal clear, though still with that strange, multi-toned quality. "Be careful driving tomorrow morning, Alex. The black SUV won't see you when it runs the red light at Maple and 3rd. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What?" "You'll be getting coffee at Carter's Diner, 8:47 a.m. If you leave 1 minute later, you'll miss it entirely. But you won't, will you? Because you need to know if I'm telling the truth." My hands were shaking as I wrote down the details. "Why are you telling me this?" "The same reason your father needed to know about the ice on the stairs. The same reason Sarah Mitchell needed to know about the gas leak. Time isn't as linear as you think, Alex. Especially not in this house." Sarah Mitchell? The name sounded vaguely familiar. "Previous owner. 20 years ago. She didn't listen. But you will, won't you? Because you're already starting to understand. You feel it when you walk through these rooms. The déjà vu, the memories that aren't yours. The way time seems to slip sideways when you're not paying attention." They were right. I had noticed it. Moments when I'd walk into a room and could have sworn the furniture was arranged differently, only to blink and see everything back in place. Times when I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, like someone just leaving a room, but the house was empty. "What's happening here?" 2 minutes, 13 seconds. Time's up, but before I go." The voice shifted, becoming somehow more substantial, more present. "Check the photo album in the attic. The red one with the broken spine. Page 17. The line went dead. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my notes. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as an elaborate prank, but another part, the part that had found that letter, that had felt the wrongness in this house, knew better. I didn't sleep that night either. Instead, I went up to the attic. I'd never been up there before, had been planning to use it for storage once I got around to clearing it out. The previous owners had left behind several boxes of what I'd assumed was junk. The red photo album was exactly where the voice said it would be, in a box labeled Family Photos, 1980-1985. The spine was broken, the pages yellowed with age. Page 17 showed a familiar scene. My parents, young and smiling, standing in front of this house. The date stamp in the corner read September 15th, 1978, the same date as the letter. But it was the background that made my blood run cold, because there, in one of the upstairs windows, was a figure. Blurry, out of focus, but unmistakably holding what looked like an old-fashioned phone to their ear. And though the photo was grainy and faded, I could have sworn the figure was wearing the same clothes I had on right now. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the sunrise through my study window, wondering what I would do when 8:47 a.m. arrived. Part of me wanted to stay home, avoid whatever the voice had predicted, but a larger part needed to know, needed to understand what was happening in this house, what had happened to Sarah Mitchell, and why, when I looked in mirrors lately, my reflection sometimes seemed to lag a few seconds behind. At 8:42 a.m., I parked outside Carter's Diner. My hands were trembling slightly as I checked my phone's clock for the 100th time that morning. The voice's prediction echoed in my head, 8:47 a.m. If you leave 1 minute later, you'll miss it entirely. Carter's was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town diner. Chrome trim, vinyl booths, and the perpetual smell of coffee and bacon. The morning crowd was thin, just a few regulars scattered among the tables. I chose a booth near the window, giving me a clear view of the intersection at Maple and 3rd. 8:45 a.m. The waitress, her name tag read Betty, brought me a coffee I didn't remember ordering. 2 sugars, splash of cream, she said, setting it down. Just how you like it. I stared at her. I haven't ordered yet. She frowned, looking confused. But you always... that's weird. Could have sworn you were a regular. She shook her head and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. 8:46 a.m. My heart was pounding now. Through the window, I could see traffic moving normally through the intersection. A school bus, a red pickup, a mail truck. 8:47 a.m. The black SUV came out of nowhere, blowing through the red light at easily 50 miles per hour. Right where my car would have been if I'd left the diner when I normally finished my morning coffee. I watched in horror as it narrowly missed a minivan, causing a cascade of screeching brakes and blaring horns. Then it was gone, leaving nothing but the echo of what could have happened, what would have happened if the voice hadn't warned me. My coffee cup clattered against its saucer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it, because there was no denying it now. The voice had known, had seen this moment before it happened. Scary, isn't it? I jumped at the voice beside me. An elderly man had slipped into the booth across from me. He wore a worn flannel shirt and had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. His eyes seemed to hold something deeper, something that made my skin crawl. The first prediction is always something like this, he continued, as if we were in the middle of a conversation. Something dramatic enough to make you believe, but not so dramatic that you'd try to prevent it. They're clever that way. They? My voice was barely a whisper. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The ones who call, the ones who live in the spaces between minutes. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. They found you too, didn't they? In that old Victorian on Hill Street. I couldn't speak, could only nod. Sarah Mitchell was my daughter, he said, and my blood ran cold. She bought that house in '99, started getting the calls a week later, always at midnight, always 2 minutes and 13 seconds. He pulled out an old leather wallet, hands trembling slightly as he extracted a faded photograph. This was the last picture taken of her, 3 weeks after the calls began. The photo showed a young woman standing in what I recognized as my study. She was pretty, with long dark hair and a warm smile, but it was her reflection in the window behind her that made my breath catch. Because while Sarah was smiling at the camera, her reflection was turned away, holding a phone to its ear. "What happened to her?" I managed to ask. The old man's eyes grew distant. "She didn't listen. Tried to change too much. You can't do that, you know. Can't change the big things. They don't like it when you try." He stood up suddenly, leaving the photograph on the table. "You should look up Theodore Walsh, 1979. Same house, same calls." He started to walk away, then paused. "And Alex, when they start calling from inside the house, run." He was gone before I could process what he'd said, lost in the morning crowd that had suddenly filled the diner. When I asked Betty about him later, she looked at me strangely. "Honey, nobody sat at your table except you. You've been talking to yourself for the past 10 minutes. I left the diner in a daze, the photograph of Sarah Mitchell burning a hole in my pocket. My mind was spinning with questions. Who was Theodore Walsh? What had Sarah tried to change? And most importantly, what did it mean that people could see me having conversations with someone who wasn't there? But I knew where to start looking for answers. The local library would have records from 1979. News articles, maybe something about Theodore Walsh and what had happened to him in my house. What I found in those archives changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of time, reality, and the thin barriers between them, because Theodore Walsh hadn't just lived in my house. He had died there. On September 15th, 1979. Exactly 1 year after my parents' photo was taken. And according to the newspaper article, his body was found clutching an old rotary phone, his last words to the 911 operator a desperate warning about the ones who call at midnight. But it was what I found in the microfiche archives that truly made my world tilt on its axis. Because there, in a grainy photograph accompanying Walsh's obituary, was a face I recognized. My own. I left the library in a panic, the photocopied obituary clutched in my trembling hands. The man in the photo, Theodore Walsh, was me. Or rather, he looked exactly like me, down to the small scar above my right eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident. But that was impossible. The photo was from 1979, 20 years before I was even born. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept circling back to something Sarah Mitchell's father had said, the ones who live in the spaces between minutes. What did that mean? And why did all of this seem to center around September 15th? I nearly missed the package sitting on my front porch. Plain brown paper, no return address, just my name written in flowing script that looked disturbingly like my own handwriting. Inside was a single cassette tape, labeled simply, Sarah, Final Call. My hands shook as I dug through boxes in the study until I found an old Sony Walkman that had belonged to the previous owners. The tape clicked into place, and Sarah Mitchell's voice filled my ears.
"If you're listening to this, you're probably the next one. I'm sorry. I tried to break the cycle, but they won't let me. The house, it's not just a house. It's a kind of intersection, a place where time folds in on itself. The calls aren't coming from someone else. They're coming from us. Different versions of us, from different times, all trying to warn each other. But warning isn't enough. You have to understand what's really happening."
Static interrupted her voice, and for a moment, I heard that familiar multi-tone sound from my midnight calls.
"They're not helping us.
Sarah's voice continued, more urgent now.
They're feeding off us, off our choices, our changes, our attempts to fix the past. Each call, each change, it gives them more power, more control over the spaces between time. I found Theodore Walsh's journal hidden in the basement behind the old coal chute. He discovered the truth too, but too late, just like I did, just like you will."
More static, longer this time. When her voice returned, it was almost a whisper.
"Don't trust the calls. Don't trust your reflection. And whatever you do, don't answer when they start calling from inside the house. That's how they..."
The tape cut off in a burst of static. I sat there in the growing darkness, the empty tape clicking softly as it continued to spin. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the study in shades of deep orange and purple. My reflection in the window seemed to watch me with an expression that wasn't quite my own. The basement. I needed to find that journal. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended into the darkness. The basement was unfinished, all stone walls and exposed pipes, with a dirt floor in the oldest section. The cold chute Sarah mentioned was in the far corner, a rusted metal door set into the wall. It took me 20 minutes of searching before I found it, a loose stone behind the cold chute door. Inside the small cavity was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. The name inside read Theodore Walsh, but the handwriting was mine. Every single word. I read until my eyes burned, the journal's contents confirming my worst fears. Theodore had discovered what the house really was, a kind of temporal sink, drawing in certain people across different time periods. People like us who could sense the thin spots in reality, who could hear the voices that existed in the spaces between moments. But it was his final entry that made my blood run cold. September 14th, 1979. They're not calls from different times. That's what they want us to think. Each call, each change we make based on their warnings, it thins the barriers between moments, between realities. I finally understand why it's always 2 minutes and 13 seconds. That's how long it takes them to feed, to drain away a piece of our timeline, our reality. Each call creates another crack, another way for them to seep through. Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I tried to warn you. Alex, if you're next, there's still time. The cycle can be broken, but only if you... The entry ended there, mid-sentence. The rest of the pages were blank. A floorboard creaked overhead. Then another. Footsteps moving slowly across the first floor, heading toward the basement door. And in my pocket, my phone began to ring. It was 11:59 p.m. 1 minute until midnight. 1 minute until the next call. But this time, the sound wasn't coming from the landline upstairs. It was coming from every phone in the house. All at once. The ringing was deafening, a cacophony of different tones, from old-fashioned bells to modern digital chirps, all slightly out of sync. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the house's ancient bones. I backed away from the basement door, Theodore's journal clutched to my chest. The footsteps above had stopped, but something worse had taken their place. The sound of multiple voices, all speaking at once. My voice, Sarah's voice, Theodore's voice, all overlapping, all saying different things in that same multi-toned whisper. The basement lights flickered and died. In the darkness, my phone's screen lit up. Midnight. But I didn't answer it. Sarah's warning echoed in my mind. Don't answer when they start calling from inside the house. Instead, I opened the journal again, using my phone's light to illuminate Theodore's final pages. There had to be more, something hidden, something I'd missed. And there was. In the back cover, barely visible, was a small tear in the leather binding. I worked my fingers into it and pulled, revealing a folded piece of paper hidden in the cover's lining. It was newer than the journal, written in Sarah's handwriting. The only way to break the cycle is to let time catch up to itself. They can't feed on moments that align. September 15th, 2024, midnight. All versions must be present. All phones must ring. But none can be answered. That's the key. That's what Theodore was trying to tell me. Don't answer. Don't let them in. Let time. The rest was torn away. Above me, the footsteps resumed, coming closer, coming down. My phone showed 12:01 a.m., 1 minute into the call. The basement door opened with a long, slow creak. In the dim light from my phone, I saw them. Shadows at first, then more. Theodore Walsh, looking exactly like the photo from his obituary. Sarah Mitchell, just as she appeared in her father's picture. And others, so many others, all with features I recognized from my own face, all holding phones to their ears. They moved like time-lapse photography, jerky and too fast, then impossibly slow. Their faces flickered between expressions, ages, genders, as if they were cycling through every possible version of themselves. Join us, Alex, they spoke in unison, their voices creating that familiar multi-toned whisper. Answer the call. Complete the cycle. But something was wrong. Their movements, they weren't coming toward me. They were being pulled toward something. Toward the old rotary phone on the basement wall, the one I'd never noticed before, identical to the one upstairs. The one that was ringing louder than all the others. That's when I understood. The phones weren't just a means of communication. They were anchors, holding open the spaces between moments. Each one represented a different time, a different reality, all converging on this point. I looked at my phone's screen again, 12:02 a.m. 13 seconds left. Sarah's note, let time catch up to itself. Theodore's warning, each call creates another crack. And suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I ran to the rotary phone on the wall, but not to answer it. Instead, I gripped the cable where it entered the wall and pulled with all my strength. The ancient wiring gave way with a shower of sparks. The figures screamed, a sound like static and breaking glass. Upstairs, I could hear more phones ringing. So many phones, each one a potential gateway. 12 seconds. I ran up the basement stairs, past the reaching hands of my temporal echoes, through the kitchen, yanking phones from walls, through the living room, smashing cell phones I'd never owned, up the main stairs following the sound of ringing. 11 seconds. 10. 9. Each phone I destroyed made the shadows move more frantically, their forms becoming less stable. 8. 7. 6. I reached the study, my study, Theodore's study, Sarah's study, where it had all started, where that first call had come through. 5 seconds. The cream-colored phone on my desk was ringing. They were all there now, every version of us reaching for it. Their faces were desperate, pleading, angry. 4. You're making a mistake, they said in that horrible unified voice. We can show you how to fix everything. Your past, your future, all of it. 3. I grabbed the phone. 2. But not to answer it. 1. I swung it like a weapon, smashing it against the desk again and again until it shattered into pieces of plastic and wire. 0. Everything stopped. The ringing ceased. The figures froze, their forms growing transparent like smoke in sunlight. What have you done? They whispered, their voices no longer synchronized. What have you? And then they were gone. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I stood there in my study, no one else's, surrounded by broken phones and shattered reality. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over Millbrook. September 15th, 2024. A new day. My phone lay among the debris, its screen cracked but still working. No calls, no messages, just the time. 12:03 a.m. 2 minutes and 13 seconds had passed, but this time nothing had been taken. Nothing had been fed upon. Time had simply moved forward the way it was supposed to. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that breaking the phones broke whatever hold that house had on time itself. But the truth is more complicated. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear echoes of ringing. Not from phones, I don't keep any in the house anymore, but from somewhere deeper. From the spaces between moments where time folds in on itself. And sometimes in the mirror, my reflection still moves a second too late. But it's my reflection now, only mine. I sold the house a week later. The new owners are a young couple with 2 kids. I didn't tell them about the calls, about Theodore or Sarah, or the things that live in the spaces between minutes. Maybe I should have, but I did leave something behind. In the basement, behind the cold chute where Theodore's journal used to be, I left a note. A warning, but also a solution. Because I know someday the phones will start ringing again. And when they do, someone else will need to know. Don't answer the call. Let time catch up to itself. And whatever you do, check the reflection in the mirror. Make sure it's looking back at you. Make sure it's yours. I still drive by the house sometimes late at night. The lights are always on in the study window now. Sometimes I see someone standing there looking out at the street, someone holding a phone to their ear, but I don't stop. I don't answer any calls from numbers I don't know. And at midnight, every night, I make sure all my clocks are synchronized, just in case. Because time doesn't always move the way we think it does. Sometimes it loops, sometimes it fractures, and sometimes in old houses with too many phones and too many memories, it hungers. But that's a story for another time. If you'll excuse me, my phone is ringing.